I thought it would be interesting when we were organizing this to talk a little bit about the engineers that worked with Louis, because it was a tradition that he was able to get a lot of support from many good engineers to support the physics work. Just to cover again what Lena said a little bit, I started working in the Alvarez group in 1960 and worked there for 10 years and had a marvelous time working on many projects. Then I worked from 1974 to 1980 with Louis and Bill Humphrey at Humphrey Instruments, which was a company that built instruments for eye doctors. And so during that period of 20 years, I spent a lot of time with Louis, and always as an engineer. I think his legacy was the training, of course, the training of and development of students and his collaborators, but it went beyond that to the development of a lot of we engineers who could support his activities. I've always considered the 10 years I spent working at the lab as a wonderful apprenticeship in how to build instruments. And so I have not been able to stay on one job very well. I've built instruments for eye care, for anesthesia monitoring, for hearing aids, for drug delivery, for monitoring heart disease. A number of companies I've started, and I think the tradition that Louis that I tried to follow was that there were many things you could do, and if you could support your activities with good people, and you could make some progress. Much of this discussion today is recollections of working with and doing these very important activities in physics and understanding the universe and understanding the history of man. But I think I want to talk today about Louis and working with engineers and his interest in business. He had interests in many things beyond physics, which included medicine. He made contributions in medicine, in flying, in warfare, in sports, and even in entertainment. So Louis was a consummate engineer, and of course, many of his inventions and successes are described in books by him and again by Peter Trower and by others. I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of his business projects. He worked with Lawrence on a color TV system in the 50s. It was a very clever idea, but it never saw the light of day because Lawrence could never find a way to break the control that RCA had over color television. And it subsequently, after the patents ran out, turned out to be a successful system manufactured by Sony, which was the terminal gun system that had terminal color guidance at the screen. I don't think that Lawrence, and certainly Louis, never made any money from that marvelous device. He worked with Hewlett-Packard, and for years he was on the board of directors of Hewlett-Packard. He was a good friend of Bill Hewlett's and Dave Packard's. They worked together on a lot of projects, and also He was a consultant to Don Hammond, who's here, and to Barney Oliver at HP Labs for years, and made a major contribution to the instrument business of Hewlett-Packard and to their medical business. He even invented a cancer treatment system, which I learned recently. He presented to Packard, and Packard said, "No, we don't do that, but we'll just give it to Varian." And it turns out to be continuing to be a product that Varian produces to treat cancer. And a little like Moshe said, Louis once told me that he would, in fact, even though he was actually paid pretty well by Hewlett-Packard to work there, he would be happy to pay to go work at Hewlett-Packard because he was having so much fun doing it. Louis had ideas with Bill Humphrey in ophthalmology and some marvelous devices to measure and to build optical devices and to treat eye disease and monitor eye disease. He and Bill had a company that developed his marvelous variable focus lens, which I think most of you have seen, and Bill will probably explain, and devised a number of products that were really very clever new ideas to monitor and to diagnose eye disease. The company was local here, and after several years, in fact 8 years, in which I was privileged to be president, was sold to Carl Zeiss and is still operating in the Bay Area. And Carl Zeiss now operates. It's the high-tech part of the Carl Zeiss eye care diagnostic division. He and Bill invented a technique to do stabilized optics, which was, after his death, was continued with by Jan, his widow, and subsequently sold to Canon. And it is the basis and the platform for the beautiful Canon stabilized lenses for their cameras and for their stabilized binoculars, which I'm sure many of you have seen or have. We all know the history of, this is some of the things that Rich might have said, the history of the Rad Lab and radar and MIT and the work at Los Alamos. In addition to his landing being able to help land lots of airplanes in Britain during the war, he also, the GCA system was also the basis of, and probably permitted the Berlin airlift to succeed. It's interesting that one of Louis's fundamental patents on radar side lobes is still in use today, which was a way to improve the radar signals. I think there's a couple of other anecdotes that are interesting. I know that Louis told me once that he'd been sent to Vietnam at the request of John Kennedy in 1962, and the task was to figure out what to do about counterinsurgency warfare. And Louis came back and thought that he could find a way to fight at night. And he sent his engineer, Pete Schwemmen, into some secret room at the lab, which no one knew where it was, but it was secret. And Pete, after a few months, came back, and they produced the concept of starlight scopes using the new image intensifiers so that the military could fight at night, which in fact is the major change in the way the U.S. fights wars these days. all done secretly, only heard about it very late. He also, with Pete Schwemmen, who was his colleague and a very clever engineer, Louis knew many people in the dark side of the government, in CIA and other military intelligence areas, and they had the problem that that they had a spook buried someplace behind the Iron Curtain, and they wanted to copy some document, and so he had Pete invent and develop a commemorative fountain pen that was really a camera that had a strip of film in it, so you could run it across a piece of paper and take a picture. Again, only heard about this years after it happened, but it just shows some of the clever ideas Louis has had and his ideas and how to use the talented engineers like Pete to develop a thing like this. I never saw it, but I only heard about it very late on the game. The question was, how did Louis develop his techniques to deal with engineers? I think part of it is that Lawrence effectively used engineers. In fact, he was a good friend of Bill Brobeck's, who was the inventor and builder of, not the inventor, but the builder of some of the large cyclotrons and the Bevatron. And Brobeck was later, was in the cyclotron business in Berkeley. And so he and Louis were friends, and in fact, I think that was a good start of Louis trying to understand how he was going to use engineers in some of his activities. Of course, he had working with him his old friend Don Gao, who I only knew for a short time before he left the lab, and he developed the bubble chamber, and he decided to use professional engineers to develop the bubble chambers. And in fact, he brought in, he was working with Bob Watt and Paul Hernandez so that the bubble chambers would be professionally designed because of the very complicated issues about designing in regimes that no one had worked in before, which is very low temperatures, 20 K, with a pulsing tank of 400 liters of liquid hydrogen, pulsing 6 times a second, which is, of course, to an engineer a frightening concept that you'll have a fatigue failure. I think because of this professional engineering, there was never an accident with the hydrogen bubble chamber. It worked well for years here, and completely with complete safety, despite the bell, which Moshe has suggested might have caused a terrible explosion. I think a measure of his respect for the importance of engineers was I've heard that the morning he got the prize, he called Bob Watt, the engineer in charge of running the bubble chamber, and said, "We won." So I think his respect for engineers and his ability to work with them is certainly was very important to me. Rich talked a little bit about his ideas, which he had, hundreds of ideas, and got it. And he brought up. He would call many of us in the evenings after his dinner, and usually in the middle of my dinner, with a new idea, a time or two a week, and suggest an idea. And I think the only my responsibility was to see if I could, by the next morning, tell him why it was no good. The trouble with that was, as Rich had said, 1 in 10 was really pretty good, and it was hard to sort them out. But that was done a number of times. I remember he called one night, again about the Alaska pipeline, which the welds were failing and there was a big problem, and suggested an idea about how to deal with measuring the welds. And by noon the next day, we were talking to Steve Bechtel on the telephone. It turns out that Bechtel, in fact, solved his own problem, but in fact, it shows how aggressive Louis would go after an idea like that. I want to say something about the risk. Louis was really very willing to take risks, and for example, in the Happy project, it was an enormous project, and we lost the balloon at sea. It was a prototype test of the launching and recovery method, but he was, several of us thought that we could probably make and NASA was running out of money for that project, so we tried to find several of us thought that we could probably find a way to keep the project going by building a smaller magnet on a cheaper balloon. And in fact, we took on the project of building a small superconducting magnet and did it completely hidden from the laboratory except for Louis. We built it in the back of Building 46. We borrowed or stole everything we could from the laboratory to build it, and in fact got a pretty good magnet running, which was subsequently flown by Andy Buffington and George Smoot and Rich Miller and others, I think successfully. But it was interesting that Louis knew we were building this magnet. We only talked rarely about the fact that we were working on something, but we had complete cover. And I think he really loved to see that going on at the lab. I think you were down to what? We're done? Okay. I want to mention one other thing, which is that Louis gave me the opportunity to work on lots of projects. Some of them were to build a small superconductor, to build the Happy balloon project, in which I had a major responsibility. We looked at the Crab pulsar with some equipment we built with the 200-inch telescope, which was later published by Anderson and Crawford and Cuddeback, to see if there was any fine structure in the pulses from the Crab pulsar. I was able to build some equipment to help range the Apollo 11 retroreflector that was left on the moon. We used the telescope for that. And of course, I worked for several years on measuring machines and the spiral reader, which was able to push the measuring rate of the group close to 1 million events a year. And we'll talk about that a little later. Just a couple of anecdotes and I'll finish. During the time that Louis and Walter were working on the impact, I was in business with Louis with the ophthalmology business, and we would have lunch 1 or 2 times, sometimes three times a week. There are two interesting things. One is I never saw Louis order anything but a hamburger with lots of ketchup and a Heineken's in the whole years I worked with him. It was very interesting. But I think the most important, the most interesting thing there, and a great privilege for me, was to hear his ideas about the impact theory and all the cul-de-sacs he ran into, and then the few ideas that really worked. And we would talk about those every day. It was just delightful to see how he worked and how he thought. The other thing is that Louis taught me one thing, and I think taught all the engineers, that it was really important to push hard on all the limits, and that if your junk pile wasn't big enough, you must not be trying hard enough. So I've taken that to heart the rest of my career, and I really believe that much of whatever success I've had is due to the way that Louis taught me to think about solving problems. Thank you very much.